big?
We also have made use of the day to do things like meet with the governor's staff, and certainly will try to have individual meetings with other journalists who might want to know on this topic.
How big will my paycheck have to be to list all of the places that my tax money's going? And that's what you want. I mean, we got a project in St. Louis, we got a project in Portageville, we got a project in St. Joe, 2 projects in Rolla. So
oh, this is about
a list.
The particular that particular kind of tax credit where the boss gets to keep the taxes.
Yeah. So to be clear, the distinction we're drawing is simply that whether they like it or not, at least people know that their taxes are going for public services. But in the case of these 22 programs in the 16 states, that's literally not true. It really is fish and fowl here. It's a really distinct thing. And they've been growing rapidly. 6 of them have been enacted in just the last 3 years.
So then my paycheck would list X percent is going to historic tax credits, X percent is going to this or that tax credit program?
No, it would simply say, for instance, if you had $50 deducted and your employer was entitled to 3/4 of it, that $12.50 went to Jefferson City and $37.50 went back to your employer.
This is for that specific kind of subsidy that's fairly new, like was in the China Hub bill last year, where persons who got it got to keep part of the withholding taxes that their employees paid. We're used to the taxes that employees pay going to state services of some kind, whether K through 12 education or Medicaid to make sure that grandma can stay in a assisted living if she needs to. But in this case, the employer actually gets to keep some of the taxes. So that's what we want to have a truth in taxation on, is if your employer is getting to keep some of those taxes as sort of a sweetheart deal for them to entice them to stay in your state or be in your state, then you should know that that's where the tax dollars are going, is to your employer.
Are you going to try to put this on as a vehicle to some other bill, and do you think there's an appropriate vehicle for that?
As you know, all of us look for bills that open the right section of Missouri Code, and I am looking for those now, yes. I've been somewhat hesitant to offer my bills that haven't had hearings yet onto another bill, because people, my colleagues are a little more hesitant about taking an amendment on the floor if it hasn't been heard somewhere, so that people on the committee can talk about what they learned at the committee hearing. I've broken that exception in some cases, like the one on the deductibility for federal taxes paid that I've been offering lately. And what happened there is Representative Funderburk had promised me a hearing, but his son is ill, and so he's actually just not been here, and I think that's what's gone wrong there, is that I haven't had a hearing on that bill. So I've gone ahead and started to offer it as a way to try to get some discussion of it, and I'm hoping to have that bill transferred over to Ways and Means, and it was assigned to tax reform so that we can have a discussion of that. But yes, once this bill is heard today, I'll feel that I have permission to put it on every bill that it's a possible match for, so that we can have some floor discussion of it.
So Representative Oxford, there's a couple of bills out there that would call on both Kansas and Missouri, and I apologize if you talked about this, a couple of bills that would call on both Kansas and Missouri to put down a moratorium on tax credits that are part of the border war, that is trying to draw businesses back and forth without any net job creation. Do you support those bills, especially the one that's already gone to the Senate that says, well, if Kansas doesn't sign the legislation, we should ramp up our spending in that area?
I believe I was a no vote on that because of the ramp up our spending part. And my bill has this part that's about not playing rob your neighbor.
Yeah.
We shouldn't play rob your neighbor anymore. But it's sort of like, well, you have enough nuclear bombs to destroy the planet 4 times over, so I'm going to build enough to blow it up 6 times over. It seems like not exactly the best solution to the problem is to say, well, then we're just going to outspend you, by golly. Because we really are at this point where we're $4 billion below our Hancock caps, and every dollar that we take away gores somebody's ox.
Mm-hmm. And do you really think that states, should be able to tell another state to stop their spending on tax incentives like that? I mean, how much control do you really think we have over?
I don't think it's about telling other states. I think that what we all should do is use evidence-based decision-making about our tax credit programs so that we follow best practices that actually work to create jobs and that don't, mortgage the farm to do so. An example of something crazy that states have done, I started the group that fought the tax dollars for the ballpark deal, and part of that was that we had evidence in Ohio, that for the ballparks that they built with taxpayer subsidies there, each job created cost over $300,000. And their Department of Economic Development usually spent less than $7,000 to create a job. So if you can create a job for either $7,000 or over $300,000, which would you do? We need to show some sense. So basically, we're not saying to other states, you know, like lecturing mama here or something, you can't do this. We're saying, let's all show some common sense about this and put our tax credit efforts into what really produces jobs at a living wage for our citizens.
It sounds like unilateral disarmament.
That's the fear, isn't it? Is all of us are afraid to blink for fear that the other state will do something that we didn't do and that it'll mean jobs, and that's what keeps us from participating in these kind of common sense measures at times. So what we hope is that all states will look at the data that we have and make decisions that are good for their states. A lot of us are bleeding from these kind of programs that aren't documenting successes.
Is Kansas bleeding? Do we have bleeding?
You know more about that, probably.
That's a Civil War reference, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would go further. I would say this is not, there's unilateral disarmament and there's being a chump, right? And when you are overpaying and, you know, racing to the bottom in a way that's undermining your ability to sustain business fairness, I think you're being a chump. We quoted 17 business leaders who a year ago in the Kansas City metropolitan area wrote an open letter to Governors Nixon and Brownback saying, quit the border wars. The only winners here are companies that either are footloose or create the appearance of being footloose. Everybody else is getting stuck with higher taxes and lousier public services. There is no federal leadership on this issue. There was a Supreme Court decision called Daimler Chrysler v. Cuno, in which the Supreme Court basically threw it back to the states and dodged the issue. There isn't going to be any federal leadership on this. The states need to grow up. There's a basic honesty issue here, an intellectual honesty issue here. Many of these programs are either created explicitly for interstate job piracy or they are knowingly frequently used for interstate job piracy by allowing existing jobs to be relabeled new jobs the moment they cross a state line. That's dishonest.
You talked earlier about making sure that jobs are good and market-based wages and meeting job standards. The two tax credits that seem to be taking the most flack in this area for low-income housing and for historic preservation, which the critics say return about 11 cents on the dollar. Now, do you think that those fall into your category of being acceptable tax credit programs, or should we ditch them?
We did not examine those programs. I know you had a huge incentives review commission here that reported out in December of 2010 and had critical things to say about many of your programs, including those too. But because those are more housing and neighborhood-based, they're more community development rather than economic development programs, we were only able to grade 5 programs per state, so they were not among the ones we graded.
And I have sponsored legislation in the past that's about reforming the low-income housing tax credit through the MHDC because of the audit that showed that we weren't getting a lot of housing out of each dollar spent. But on the other hand, I've been a defender of the historic preservation tax credit because I think the data is there that is producing jobs and that a lot of the supplies purchased to use in those rehabs does come from the local area. So it appears to me that the evidence is that the historic preservation tax credit does produce jobs locally and helps projects be completed that wouldn't happen otherwise. So I've been a defender of that tax credit. I certainly also agree that we need more affordable housing. There's probably no issue that hurts St. Louis Public Schools more than the transience of the students there, that they move all the time, and that's because their families can't find affordable housing. So I'd like to see us increase our affordable housing stock. Back in the old days when I directed an anti-poverty program, there was a committee in the House that actually would hear bills that was about housing, but we've seemed to have just ceded that fight. We don't even have a committee anymore that has housing as a part of its charge, really. I think that we should renew our interest in providing affordable housing for our workforce.
Yeah, if I'm a worker and I get a paycheck that says that of my $100 in income taxes, $55 is coming back to my employer. As a worker, what kind of reaction should I have? Should I demand that I get that money myself and that I keep it? Are you not? Wouldn't this cause some employer-employee relationship problems?
It's hard to know because right now not one single state requires that workers be notified that this is happening. That's why we made that recommendation. It really stood out to us. I think it would cause some conversations, whether it would cause frictions or just greater awareness, and people making more sure that there's really good economic development occurring, a good bang for the buck, you know, that it's a free country and a free market that way. But I think we can't know exactly what it would cost. But, you know, it's very much in the same vein of tax increment financing. So the state of Illinois actually has formally explored and decided not, for now, not to require that when you pay your property taxes, and if 30% of the money doesn't go to schools and police and fire, but instead goes to the TIF district, that you be so notified. So at least one county treasurer in the state does that as their own kind of statement about truth in taxation as well.